Meadowbrook, Indiana, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets rarely stayed hidden. For Simon and Nancy Wilson, their modest home on Elm Street seemed like just another house in a row of similar ones. But behind their front door, a storm had been brewing for months, one that would leave the entire neighborhood reeling. Nancy's husband, Simon Wilson, was a mechanic known for his hardworking nature and quiet demeanor. But beneath the surface of their modest life lay cracks that no one had seen coming. Simon Wilson had always been a man who prided himself on hard work. His days started early and ended late, spent under the hoods of cars at his small repair shop in the heart of Meadowbrook, a mid-sized Midwestern city. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but it was honest work. He'd built the business from the ground up, and while it wasn't raking in the cash, it was enough to keep the lights on and food on the table, most of the time. Nancy, his wife of nearly a decade, worked as a secretary for Hawthorne Realty, one of the most successful real estate firms in the area. Her boss, Richard Hawthorne, was a sharp dresser with $1 million smile and the charm to match. Every time Nancy talked about Richard, Simon felt a twinge of unease, but he never said anything. It wasn't like he could control who Nancy worked for, and besides, they'd always trusted each other. Or so he thought. Their marriage had always had its ups and downs, but lately, the downs seemed to last longer. They argued more often than not, usually about money. The bills were piling up, the roof needed fixing, and Nancy had started dropping hints about wanting to move into a bigger, nicer home. "Simon, we can't keep living like this," she said one night over dinner, her fork poking at the chicken on her plate. "Don't you want more for us?" "For me?" Simon sighed, setting his glass of water down. "Of course I do, Nancy. But where's the money going to come from? I'm doing everything I can." "That shop isn't enough," Nancy shot back, her voice sharp. "You could expand, hire more guys, take on more jobs. But you're stuck doing the same thing day in and day out." Simon bit his tongue, swallowing his frustration. He worked harder than anyone he knew, but no matter how much he did, it never seemed to be enough for Nancy. In the months that followed, Simon started noticing changes in Nancy. She began dressing differently, more polished, more expensive. Gone were the practical blouses and flats she used to wear. Now it was fitted blazers, sleek heels, and just the right amount of makeup. "You're really dressing up these days," Simon commented one evening as Nancy walked through the door, her heels clicking against the tile. "It's the office," Nancy replied, brushing past him and heading for the kitchen. "Richard wants us to project a professional image. You know, look like we belong in those big houses we're selling." Simon nodded, but the explanation didn't sit right with him. Nancy wasn't just dressing up. She was staying late at work more often, always with a perfectly reasonable excuse. "It's a client dinner," she'd say. Or, "We had a last-minute showing." One night, Simon sat on the couch, flipping through the channels, when Nancy walked in with her phone pressed to her ear. Her face was lit up with a smile, and she was laughing, really laughing, in a way he hadn't heard in years. "No, you didn't," she said, her voice playful. "You're terrible." Simon muted the television and turned toward her. "Who's that?" Nancy's smile faltered for a split second before she turned her back to him. "It's just work stuff," she said quickly, her tone dismissive. "Didn't sound like work," Simon said, his eyes narrowing. "It's nothing," Nancy replied, slipping her phone into her pocket. "Richard just had a funny story about a client." Simon's stomach churned. Something about the way she avoided his eyes made him uneasy, but he didn't push it. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he was reading too much into things. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Simon started paying closer attention. Nancy was on her phone constantly, always smiling or laughing at something on the screen. When he asked her about it, she brushed him off. "It's just work emails," she'd say, or, "I'm going over the schedule for tomorrow." Simon wanted to believe her, but the doubt gnawed at him. It wasn't just the phone or the late nights. It was the way she looked at him, or didn't look at him. She'd always been the type to meet him at the door with a kiss and ask about his day. Now, she barely acknowledged him when she came home, her mind somewhere else entirely. One evening, as Nancy sat at the kitchen table, typing on her laptop, Simon stood in the doorway watching her. She was wearing one of her new blouses, the kind she never would have bought a year ago, and her hair was freshly styled. "Big day tomorrow?" Simon asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Nancy glanced up briefly. "Yeah, we've got a big client meeting in the morning. Richard wants everything to be perfect." Simon nodded, forcing a smile. "You're working hard. I'm proud of you." "Thanks," Nancy said, her attention already back on the screen. Simon turned away, his chest tight. He wanted to believe her, to trust that everything she was doing was for the good of their marriage. But the little voice in the back of his mind wouldn't let him. Later that night, as Simon sat in bed scrolling through his phone, Nancy's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it quickly, her fingers moving to swipe the screen before he could even glance at it. "Who's texting you this late?" Simon asked, trying to keep his tone light. "Work stuff," Nancy said, not looking up. Simon clenched his jaw. "Seems like Richard keeps you pretty busy, even outside of work hours." Nancy's head snapped up. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," Simon said quickly, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Just making an observation." Nancy glared at him for a moment before turning back to her phone. "You're being ridiculous, Simon." As she tapped away on her screen, Simon lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. The doubt that had been simmering for weeks was starting to boil over, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep it contained. The breaking point came a week later. Simon was in the garage, wiping grease off his hands, when he heard Nancy's voice from the kitchen. "You're terrible," she said, laughing in that same carefree way he hadn't heard in years. "No, stop it. I'm serious." Simon froze, his heart pounding. He stepped quietly toward the kitchen, straining to hear the conversation. "No, you didn't," Nancy said, her tone playful. "That's ridiculous. I can't believe you." Simon walked into the room, his eyes narrowing as he saw Nancy leaning against the counter, her phone pressed to her ear. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Nancy jumped, her face flushing as she turned to him. "It's just work stuff," she said, slipping the phone into her pocket. "Didn't sound like work," Simon said, his hands on his hips. Nancy brushed past him, heading for the living room. "You're overreacting, Simon. It's nothing." But Simon didn't believe her, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the truth. Simon had noticed subtle changes in Nancy for months. At first, it was the small things. The way she started dressing a little nicer for work, the extra time spent perfecting her makeup in the mornings, the occasional vague mention of Richard, her boss. None of it seemed alarming on its own, but together, it started forming a picture he couldn't ignore. She began working later hours, her reasons always sounding plausible. A last-minute showing, paperwork that needed immediate attention, or a client who wanted to meet after hours. Simon tried not to question it. He told himself it was good that Nancy was so dedicated to her job, especially with money being tight. But the unease gnawed at him, growing stronger every time she breezed through the door with a tired smile and little explanation. Then there was her phone. It seemed glued to her hand, buzzing constantly with notifications she would glance at but never share. When Simon asked about it, she would wave it off with a casual, "just work stuff," and change the subject. He wanted to believe her, but the secrecy left a bitter taste in his mouth. One night, while tidying up their bedroom, Simon found something he couldn't ignore. He had opened Nancy's dresser drawer to put away some folded laundry and spotted a small velvet box tucked beneath her neatly arranged clothes. His curiosity got the better of him, and he opened it. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, clearly expensive, with intricate detailing. His heart sank. They hadn't exchanged gifts in months, and even if they had, this wasn't something he could afford. Nancy hadn't mentioned buying it, and Simon knew it wasn't from him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the bracelet, his mind racing. When he brought it up to her later that evening, Nancy was immediately defensive. "It's a gift from the office," she said, brushing off his concern. "Richard gives out things like that for hitting sales goals. It's not a big deal." Simon wanted to believe her, but her tone gave her away. She sounded rehearsed, like she had anticipated the question and prepared an answer. He didn't press further, not wanting to start an argument, but the interaction left a pit in his stomach. The following days were tense. Simon found himself analyzing every interaction with Nancy, every glance she exchanged with her phone, every excuse she made for being late. He hated feeling like a suspicious husband, but he couldn't shake the sense that something was off. One Friday, he decided he needed answers. Leaving the shop early, Simon drove to Hawthorne Realty and parked across the street. He sat in his truck, waiting and watching as employees began trickling out of the building at the end of the day. Finally, he saw Nancy step outside. She wasn't heading to her car, though. Instead, she walked toward a sleek black sedan parked near the entrance. Richard was leaning against it, waiting for her. Simon gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he watched Nancy smile and greet her boss. They got into the car together and drove off, and Simon followed at a safe distance, his heart pounding. They pulled into the parking lot of an upscale restaurant on the other side of town. Simon parked a block away and walked toward the building, careful to stay out of sight. Through the restaurant's large front windows, he spotted them immediately. Nancy and Richard were seated at a corner table, leaning in close to each other. They were laughing, their body language unmistakably intimate. Richard reached across the table and placed his hand on Nancy's, and Simon's stomach churned. He pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos, his hands shaking. He wanted to burst through the doors, to demand answers right then and there, but he held back. Confronting them in public wouldn't fix anything. It would only make things worse. Over the weekend, Simon couldn't think about anything else. The photos on his phone were undeniable proof, but part of him hoped there was some explanation he hadn't considered. Maybe Richard had manipulated her. Maybe she didn't really want to be with him. Simon clung to those thin strands of hope, even as the reality of what he'd seen tore at him. On Sunday evening, as Nancy sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, Simon couldn't hold back any longer. He set his phone on the coffee table, the photos of her and Richard displayed on the screen. "What's this?" he asked, his voice tight. Nancy froze, her face draining of color as she looked at the photos. For a moment, she said nothing, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Then she let out a long breath and met his gaze. "Simon," she began, her tone cautious, "I didn't want you to find out this way." "That's not an answer," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "Are you seeing him?" Nancy nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes, we've been seeing each other for a while." Simon felt like the air had been knocked out of him. "How long?" he managed to ask. "Months," she admitted. "It started as work lunches, but it turned into something more." Simon stared at her, his mind reeling. "Why, Nancy? After everything we've been through, why would you do this?" "It's not about you, Simon," she said, her tone firm. "It's about what I want for my future. Richard can give me things you can't, things I've been waiting for years. Stability, security, a real chance at a better life." Her words hit him harder than any punch ever could. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but the weight of her confession left him speechless. The conversation ended with Nancy retreating to the bedroom, leaving Simon alone with the photos still glaring at him from his phone screen. He didn't move for hours, his mind replaying the events over and over. The woman he thought he'd spend his life with had made it clear. She didn't believe in him anymore. That night, Simon didn't sleep. He sat in the living room, staring at the darkened hallway, wondering if there was anything left to save, or if it had all been lost the moment Nancy met Richard. Simon poured every ounce of himself into trying to fix his marriage, pushing his exhaustion and doubts to the back of his mind. He didn't just want to prove to Nancy that he could change. He needed to prove it to himself. His days at the shop were grueling. He took on every job he could get, from simple oil changes to time-consuming transmission rebuilds. By the end of the week, his hands were raw, his back ached, and he barely had time to eat between jobs. But Simon didn't care. He started looking for opportunities to make more money wherever he could find them. A friend at the shop suggested offering mobile repairs for people stranded with broken-down vehicles, and Simon jumped at the idea. He spent weekends driving across town, fixing cars in driveways and parking lots. Some nights, he didn't get home until midnight, but he'd walk through the door hoping Nancy might notice the sacrifices he was making. At first, there were moments that gave him hope. Nancy started acknowledging his efforts, albeit briefly. She'd comment on how late he was working or how he seemed more motivated. But Simon knew those words lacked sincerity. It wasn't appreciation. It was polite observation, like she was checking a box to acknowledge his efforts without truly caring about the outcome. What stung more was that Nancy had stopped trying herself. While Simon was working late nights and pouring everything into their future, Nancy was coasting. She made no effort to meet him halfway, no gestures to show she believed in him. The gap between them, which he'd hoped to close with hard work, seemed to stretch wider with every passing day. At home, Simon tried to create moments to reconnect with her. One Friday night, after finishing a particularly grueling week, he picked up her favorite takeout and came home early. He set the table and even lit candles, hoping it would feel like the date nights they used to have when life wasn't so complicated. When Nancy walked in, her reaction was lukewarm. She sat at the table, scrolling through her phone between bites, barely engaging in conversation. Simon asked her how work was going, how things were at the office, but her answers were short and vague. "It's fine," she said at one point, not even looking up. Simon clenched his jaw but forced himself to stay calm. "I've been thinking about taking on some bigger projects at the shop," he said, trying to steer the conversation toward the future. "If I can get a loan, maybe expand the garage, hire another guy." "That's great, Simon," Nancy interrupted, her tone dismissive. "I'm sure it'll work out." She stood, gathering her plate before he could respond. "I'm going to bed. Thanks for dinner." Simon sat at the table long after Nancy had gone, staring at the empty seat across from him. The silence in the house was deafening, and for the first time, he let himself feel the weight of the situation. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he gave, it was clear Nancy had already checked out. His suspicions solidified further when he began noticing her phone habits again. She was always glued to the screen, typing away with a faint smile on her face. If Simon walked into the room, she'd immediately lock the screen or set it face down on the table. It was like watching a replay of the months before she confessed to the affair, and Simon hated that he recognized the signs. One night, he tried to break the ice. "Nancy," he said carefully, "is everything okay? You've been distant." She looked up from her phone, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine," she said flatly. "You don't seem fine," he pressed. "You barely talk to me anymore." "Are you still?" he trailed off, unsure if he wanted to finish the question. "Still what?" she asked, her tone defensive. Simon shook his head, backing down. "Never mind." But the question lingered in his mind long after their conversation ended. Was she still talking to Richard? Was she still seeing him? Every time her phone buzzed, Simon felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew he couldn't keep living like this, waiting for the other shoe to drop. A few days later, Simon came home earlier than usual, hoping to catch Nancy before she retreated into her usual shell. The house was quiet when he walked in, but the faint glow of light from the living room told him she was there. As he approached, he heard the familiar sound of her fingers tapping away on her phone. She was lying on the couch, her legs curled under her, completely engrossed in whatever she was typing. Simon hesitated in the doorway, watching her for a moment. She looked happy, more relaxed than she ever did when they were talking. It was a look he hadn't seen in years, and it broke his heart to know it wasn't because of him. "What's got you so distracted?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Nancy jumped, quickly locking her phone and sitting up. "Nothing," she said, too quickly. Simon stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You've been on that thing nonstop lately. What's going on, Nancy?" "Simon, don't start," she said, her tone exasperated. "I'm not starting anything," he said, his voice rising despite himself. "But I've been exhausting myself trying to make this work, and all I get from you is silence. You're acting like you don't even care anymore." Nancy stood, brushing past him with her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "I don't have time for this," she muttered, heading toward the bedroom. Simon didn't follow her. He stood in the living room, his fists clenched, watching as she disappeared down the hallway. He felt the familiar knot of anger and frustration rising in his chest, but this time, it was mixed with something heavier, resignation. He wanted to believe there was still hope for them, that all the work he was putting in wasn't for nothing. But deep down, Simon knew the truth. Nancy's heart wasn't in it anymore. And no matter how much he tried, he couldn't make her stay. Simon slumped onto the couch, utterly drained. The shop had been chaotic all day, and his body ached from hours of lifting, bending, and twisting under car hoods. But his exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was emotional, the kind of weight that sleep couldn't shake off. He rubbed his temples, trying to tune out the gnawing thoughts about Nancy, Richard, and everything he had been fighting so hard to hold together. Nancy had been distant all evening, moving around the house like a ghost. She'd avoided him since she walked in the door, offering only a curt "hi" before retreating into the kitchen. Simon wasn't sure what to make of her silence. Lately, it felt like every word exchanged between them was another brick pulled from the fragile wall that was their marriage. "Simon," Nancy's voice broke through the quiet. He looked up, startled by the seriousness in her tone. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What is it?" he asked, trying to gauge her expression. "Can we talk?" He nodded, sitting up a little straighter. Those 3 words rarely led to good things anymore, but he tried to steady himself. Nancy walked over to the armchair and sank into it, her movements deliberate. She looked at him, her face unreadable, then glanced away as if searching for the right words. "I need to tell you something," she said. Simon leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "All right. I'm pregnant." For a moment, Simon felt his breath catch. Pregnant? He hadn't seen this coming, but a small spark of hope flickered in the back of his mind. Maybe this could be the turning point they needed, a reason to finally start over and rebuild what had been lost. "That's wow," he said, a cautious smile forming. "That's big news. Nancy, this is amazing. We've been struggling, sure, but this is our chance to make things right." But Nancy didn't mirror his excitement. Her expression remained cold, her lips pressed into a thin line. She took a deep breath before speaking again, and Simon immediately felt the shift in the air. "Simon," she said slowly, "the baby isn't yours." The word struck him like a physical blow. He froze, his mind scrambling to make sense of what she had just said. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard her. "What do you mean?" he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's Richard's," she said bluntly, her tone devoid of emotion. Simon stared at her, his chest tightening. The room seemed to close in around him as the reality of her confession sank in. "Richard's?" he repeated, his voice trembling. Nancy nodded, looking down at her hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't plan for this, Simon." "You didn't plan for this?" Simon said, his voice rising. "You told me it was over, Nancy. You swore to me you were done with him. And now you're telling me you're pregnant with his kid?" Nancy's head snapped up, her eyes sharp. "I didn't owe you anything, Simon. You act like I cheated on you out of spite. But look at our life. Look at what we've become. I'm tired of struggling. I'm tired of waiting for you to figure it out." Simon stood, pacing the room, his emotions boiling over. "This isn't just about money, Nancy. You destroyed us. You didn't even give me a chance." She scoffed, leaning back in the chair. "I've been giving you chances for years, Simon. And where has it gotten us? I've been working my ass off, trying to make something of myself, while you're stuck in the same rut you've been in since we got married." "I'm working for us," he shot back. "Every single day. I've been working to keep this family afloat. But apparently that's not enough for you." Nancy's eyes narrowed. "It's not enough. Richard's offering me something you never could. Stability, security, a real future, and I'm taking it." Simon stopped pacing and turned to face her, his fists clenched at his sides. "So that's it? You're leaving me?" Nancy met his gaze without flinching. "I have to think about what's best for me and the baby. Richard can give us a life that you never will." Simon felt like he was drowning, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, sadness, and disbelief. He couldn't believe how easily she was willing to throw everything away. The years they'd spent together, the struggles they'd endured side by side. "You don't even care, do you?" he said, his voice cracking. "You've already made up your mind. You're just waiting for the right moment to walk out that door." Nancy sighed, standing up. "Simon, This conversation is over. I've said everything I needed to say." She turned and walked toward the bedroom, leaving Simon standing alone in the middle of the living room. His legs felt like lead, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't put into words. When the sound of her footsteps disappeared down the hall, Simon sank back onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The hope he'd held onto so tightly was gone, replaced by a suffocating sense of failure and loss. He sat there for hours, replaying every moment of their marriage in his mind. All the arguments, the broken promises, the sacrifices he thought they'd made together. It all felt meaningless now. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if there was anything left to fight for. Simon sat in the dimly lit living room, the only sound in the house coming from the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on the coffee table in front of him, its amber contents glowing faintly in the lamplight. He stared at it for a long time before reaching for his glass and taking another drink, the burn doing little to dull the ache in his chest. On the table next to the bottle was a photo album he hadn't touched in years. It had been tucked away in the closet, buried under boxes of old clothes and forgotten mementos. Now, it lay open, its pages filled with images of a time when life felt simpler, when he and Nancy were happy. He ran his fingers over a picture of the two of them at the beach, her arm wrapped around his waist as they smiled for the camera. Her eyes had sparkled back then, full of warmth and excitement. Simon couldn't reconcile the woman in the photo with the one who had just told him she was leaving to start a new life with another man. Her words played on a loop in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. "The baby isn't yours. Richard is offering me something you never could. I need to think about what's best for me and the baby." The memory of her cold, detached tone felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Simon clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the edge of the couch. He didn't know whether he was angrier at Nancy for what she'd done or at himself for letting it get this far. He'd spent years sacrificing for their marriage, working himself to the bone to provide for her, only to watch it all crumble before his eyes. He poured himself another glass, the alcohol warming his throat as it went down. But no matter how much he drank, the pain wouldn't go away. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him, the silence deafening. As he stared at the photo album, his mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Had Nancy ever loved him? Or had she been waiting for an opportunity to leave all along? Was he really as useless as she made him feel? Or was she just looking for an excuse to justify what she'd done? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Nancy walked in, her keys jangling in her hand as she set them on the counter. She glanced at Simon, her expression neutral, almost bored. "We need to talk," she said, her tone clipped. Simon didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the photo album in front of him. Nancy sighed, stepping into the living room. "I'm finalizing everything with Richard this week," she said. "We'll be leaving after that. I just thought you should know." Simon looked up at her, his face a mix of despair and anger. "Nancy, don't do this," he said quietly. "It's already done," she replied, crossing her arms. "I've made my decision, Simon. There's no point in dragging this out." "There's always a point," he said, his voice rising slightly. "We've been through too much to throw it all away now. You can't just walk out on me like this." Nancy's expression hardened. "You don't get it, do you? I'm not walking out on you, Simon. You drove me to this. You and your constant excuses, your inability to make anything of yourself. I waited for years, hoping things would get better, but they never did." Simon stood, his fists clenched at his sides. "I gave you everything I had, Nancy. I worked day and night to build a life for us. And this is how you repay me? You call this a life?" she shot back, her voice dripping with bitterness. "A rundown house, a failing garage, and a husband who can't even see how pathetic he's become? I deserve better, Simon, and Richard is giving me that chance." Her words hit him like a slap to the face. He took a step toward her, his body trembling with anger. "You think I'm pathetic?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Nancy didn't back down. "You said it, not me," she replied coldly. "Face it, Simon. You've been holding me back for years. And now, I'm done." The room seemed to blur around him as his vision narrowed on her. The words, "holding me back," echoed in his mind, striking a nerve he didn't even realize was there. His chest heaved as he tried to steady his breathing, but the rage bubbling inside him was too much to contain. Nancy turned to leave the room, dismissing him like he was nothing. And that's when something inside him snapped. Before he realized what he was doing, Simon lunged forward, his hands trembling with a surge of uncontrollable anger. "Don't walk away from me," he shouted, his voice raw with pain and desperation. Nancy stopped, turning back to face him with a look of disdain. "You're unbelievable," she said. "I'm done talking, Simon. We're done." The rest happened in a blur. His rage erupted, blinding him to everything else. The years of frustration, the betrayal, the humiliation. It all came crashing down in an instant, leaving nothing but chaos in its wake. The shock of what he had done began to settle over him like a suffocating fog, heavy and inescapable. It was as though time itself had stopped, leaving Simon frozen in the aftermath, staring at the irreversible consequence of his actions. A deep, hollow ache spread through his chest as he realized the full extent of what he'd destroyed. The life he had tried so hard to hold together now shattered beyond repair. Simon stood frozen, his chest heaving as the silence of the room bore down on him like a crushing weight. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Nancy was motionless, the reality of her stillness sending a jolt of panic through him. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. His hands trembled, and he stumbled backward, knocking into the coffee table. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as his brain fought to grasp the enormity of what he'd done. For a moment, he thought about calling the police. But the image of himself in handcuffs, his life completely destroyed, made him freeze. His instinct screamed at him to act, to do something, anything, to distance himself from the horror in front of him. Simon looked around the room, his eyes darting to the front door. The idea hit him like a flash. He could make it look like someone else had been here. A break-in gone wrong. His mind latched onto the plan, desperate for a way out. He began moving, his actions frantic and disorganized. He knocked over a chair and pulled open the drawers in the kitchen, scattering their contents across the floor. He hesitated before yanking Nancy's purse off the counter, dumping it out as if someone had rifled through it. The whole time, his mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Would the police believe it? Would the neighbors have seen or heard anything? And, most pressing of all, what was he supposed to do now? The thought of staying in the house was unbearable. He couldn't be there, not with her. Grabbing his jacket, Simon bolted out the door, leaving the chaos behind him. As he got into his truck and started the engine, his hands trembled so violently that it took him a moment to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he pulled out of the driveway without looking back. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away. The streets of Meadowbrook were eerily quiet as he drove aimlessly through the city. His mind was a storm of fear and regret, each thought more overwhelming than the last. He turned on the radio, hoping to drown out his spiraling thoughts, but what he heard made his blood run cold. "This just in," the announcer's voice crackled through the speakers. "Local police are investigating a tragedy at a residence on Hawthorne Street. The victim, identified as Nancy Wilson, was discovered earlier this evening. Authorities have not released details, but neighbors report hearing a loud argument shortly before the incident." Simon's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He hadn't even been gone an hour, and already the police were involved. He couldn't escape the suffocating feeling that they were closing in on him, even as he drove farther and farther from the city. Every mile felt heavier than the last. His paranoia grew with each passing moment, every set of headlights in his rearview mirror sending a fresh wave of panic through him. He glanced at his phone, briefly considering calling someone. Anyone. But who would he call? Who would believe him? As the hours dragged on, exhaustion began to take its toll. Simon found himself pulling into a dimly lit gas station on the edge of a small town, miles away from Meadowbrook. He parked in the shadows, far from the pumps, and rested his forehead against the steering wheel. "What the hell have I done?" he muttered to himself, his voice breaking. Inside the gas station, Simon bought a bottle of water and a cheap burner phone, paying cash and avoiding eye contact with the clerk. He kept his head down, his baseball cap pulled low, but his nervous energy drew a few glances from the other customers. Back in his truck, Simon turned on the new phone and began scrolling through news updates about Nancy. The reports were growing more detailed. Neighbors had already mentioned hearing arguments between him and Nancy in the past. Some even told reporters that Nancy had confided about problems in their marriage and hinted at the affair with her boss. Simon's stomach churned as he read. Everything was unraveling faster than he could process. The police knew about the affair, about their fights, and it wouldn't take long for them to connect the dots. He considered his next move carefully, but guilt and fear clouded his judgment. In a moment of desperation, he called his brother using the burner phone. "I need to lay low for a while," he said, his voice shaking. "Simon, what's going on?" his brother asked, but Simon hung up before he could answer. He thought it was a good idea at the time, but later realized how easily the police could trace the call. By the time he pulled into a rundown motel off the highway, Simon was operating on pure adrenaline. He paid in cash, using a fake name, and locked himself in the room. The bed was lumpy, and the walls were paper-thin, but it didn't matter. He lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling as the weight of his actions bore down on him. Back in Meadowbrook, investigators were already piecing together what had happened. The staged break-in didn't hold up under scrutiny. The drawers were rifled through too neatly, and the scene didn't match typical burglary patterns. More damning was the fact that Simon's truck had been seen leaving the house shortly before Nancy's body was discovered. By morning, his face was all over the news, labeled as a person of interest. Simon woke to the sound of a knock on his motel door. His heart sank as he peeked through the window and saw police cars surrounding the building. He hadn't been careful enough. The gas station clerk had remembered him. As the officers led him away in handcuffs, Simon's mind raced with everything he had done wrong. Every choice he'd made since that terrible moment had only made things worse. The trial was damning, with prosecutors presenting a clear case against Simon. Testimonies from neighbors about his volatile relationship with Nancy, evidence of the staged break-in, and forensic findings all pointed to his guilt. Nancy's affair with Richard, combined with their financial struggles and arguments, painted a picture of a man pushed to his breaking point. Simon's attempt to flee only solidified the prosecution's narrative, leaving his defense with little to argue. When the guilty verdict was announced, Simon showed no emotion. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life, emphasizing the premeditated nature of his cover-up as a significant factor. Nancy's family watched from the gallery, grief-stricken but relieved to see justice served. The courtroom buzzed with whispers about how a once ordinary marriage had spiraled into tragedy. Simon was led away in handcuffs, his future now confined to a prison cell. The weight of his actions hung heavy on him, as he was left to grapple with the consequences of a moment of rage that destroyed not only his life but the lives of everyone around him. The case left a scar on the community, a sobering reminder of how quickly betrayal and anger can escalate into irreversible devastation.